I'd like to focus for a little while on assessing learning in general education because a lot of schools in the academy choose a project that deals specifically with general education. Now, you have to understand, we do an entire 3-day workshop on general education, so we're going to do the greatest hits today. But know that we will be with you. If your project is Gen Ed, your mentors, your facilitators, your scholars will be working with you the whole time during your academy experience to flesh out Gen Ed. The first thing you need to know about Gen Ed is where your outcomes are and what you're calling them. Campuses call Gen Ed outcomes by a variety of different names. It could be a general education outcome. They could be general learning outcomes. In some instances, institutional outcomes are the same thing as general education outcomes, and maybe core competencies, which may double as institutional outcomes, which are the same as Gen Ed outcomes, essential skills, core values. It's really important that each school figure out where is the set of outcomes that you consider to be your general education outcomes. If you have a traditional distribution model where students are taking 2 classes, for instance, in written communication, a class in oral communication, 2 classes in sciences, 3 classes or 2 classes in social science, a math class, arts and humanities class, this may be how your Gen Ed program is structured, that you have outcomes for each of your distribution categories. Okay. It may be that you have a set of core competencies for all of Gen Ed, for all of your Gen Ed courses. In this case, each Gen Ed course is anchored on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of your different core competencies. It's also possible that you have a set, for instance, of institution-wide outcomes that are not just specifically for Gen Ed, but also for study in the major. And that the institution expects that these outcomes in some percentage will be strewn or distributed throughout the general education program, and that this is the set of outcomes that we consider to be our Gen Ed outcomes as well as our institution learning outcomes. So the first thing you need to do is figure out where your outcomes are. It's important to recognize when it comes time to assessing general education that most people start in the wrong place. There are a number of steps to assessing general education, assessing learning in general education. Starts with learning outcomes and performance indicators, assessment measures, methods, what the students are going to do, assessment measures, how we're going to know if it meets our expectation, collecting data, evaluating data as part of the implementation plan, and then using that information to improve learning. Most people want to start right here. They want to start with measures and methods. In fact, we see this in the academy all the time. Schools will want to start by developing a rubric for a writing outcome or a critical thinking outcome, when it's probably a better fit to start with looking at your learning outcomes and your performance indicators. And why do you need to start there? Because quite honestly, you need to start with good outcomes. If you don't have good learning outcomes, you're not going to be able to assess them. And if you can assess them somehow, the data will be meaningless. I like to think that the cleaner the outcome, the better. That is, the easier it is and the more meaningful the assessment. So from that standpoint, just like we talked about in the opening session, students should be able to action verb something, not students should be able to action verbs, comma, action verb, comma, something, something, and oh, hey, something else. So it's not uncommon for general education outcomes to wind up looking like this. Students should be able to identify, describe, and analyze the social, political, and environmental consequences of climate change. That's the problem with Gen Ed outcomes, is we want to cram a lot of stuff in there, or in some cases, the state has given us outcomes that look like this, and we have to figure out what we're going to do with them. Generally, the easier the outcome, the simpler the outcome in terms of the way it's stated, the easier it is to assess. So if we look at, for instance, multiple action verbs, the rule of thumb is generally if we choose the highest order action verb, in this case, analyze, and we look at the list, anytime there's an and, that's a clue that you got a lot going on. And we change this to or, the outcome could be students will be able to analyze the social, political, or environmental consequences of climate change. You stand a fighting chance of being able to assess that far more than to assess this outcome as it's currently written. You need to think ahead when you're putting together or looking at your student learning outcomes and recognize you'll need to assess all of your outcomes. This comes as a surprise to many programs that are looking at, they've got 6 different gen ed categories, but when you count up the number of outcomes in each category, you know, you're looking at more than 20 different student learning outcomes. Same thing in terms of your institutional outcomes. If you have institutional outcomes that are the same as your gen ed outcomes, okay, you have 9. Okay, so you've got to be able to think about, you need to assess what you're putting out there as student learning outcomes for general education, regardless of whether or not you consider them institution outcomes, core competencies, or whatever. When you look at your outcome, you need to be sure that the cognitive level of the learning outcome is appropriate. So remember, students will be able to action verb something. Pay attention to what this action verb is in terms of the performance level. As we talked about in the opening session, making assessment meaningful, we know that there are a number of different categories of action verbs using, in this case, the old Bloom's taxonomy. And I've listed, like I did this morning or yesterday, a number of different potential action verbs. The action verbs for your outcome need to be supported by the curriculum. So if you have 3 classes in social science and 2 classes in arts and humanities, that may change the action verb that you're looking at. For instance, for any distribution category where you have 1 course, your action verb in your outcome is probably going to be knowledge comprehension or application. If, like in social sciences, students have 3 courses, then you have an opportunity to advance the cognitive level of your student learning outcome to application, analysis, or perhaps synthesis. It's important that you assure that your gen ed outcomes are aligned with your curriculum. And this is where the implications of your GE course policies and procedures impact assessment directly. So let me illustrate for you how this can work, because it's a very common problem. The question for you is to understand how courses got into gen ed in the first place. So for instance, did each gen ed course have to demonstrate that they support all of the learning outcomes for each category, or all of your institution outcomes, or all of your core competencies? Or could a course get into general education if they met most of the outcomes, or some of the outcomes, or one of the identified outcomes? Most course proposals for gen ed say that a course has to meet 50% or at least 50% of the stated learning outcomes. So when we look at a distribution model, and we've got a number of learning outcomes here, okay, to get into gen ed, most course policies say a course would have to meet 2 of the 4, at least 2 or 3 of the 5, or whatever of the outcomes. So we have to think about that, because look at how this plays out. Let's say in this case, we need 1 course in arts and humanities, and yet we have 5 different student learning outcomes. So if we look at those student learning outcomes, we've got a laundry list of them here. Students will be able to explore global and cultural diversity, explain the ways in which humanistic or artistic expression throughout the ages expresses the culture and value of time and place, frame a comparative context to critically assess the ideas, forces, and values that have created the modern world. You see, these are fairly complex general education learning outcomes for arts and humanities. So we've got our arts and humanities outcomes illustrated. These 5 are illustrated here. Students need to take 1 class. So the question is, do the courses in the arts and humanities category meet all or some of those learning outcomes? So we've got the learning outcomes. These are now illustrated here. And we've got the approved courses, in which case I've got at least 6, but there's probably more courses that have been approved in arts and humanities. Some of those courses are 100 level courses. Some of them are 200 level courses. If the idea is that each course approved in a gen ed category has to meet all of the student learning outcomes, your map looks like this. Okay, so we know that every course is doing all of these things. Now, just on the faces of it, I'm not sure I believe that's true, but in theory, this is what we've got. Okay, but more likely, the assumption is that the approved courses have to meet some percentage of those student learning outcomes. So let's say, for instance, that the institution says that each course has to meet at least 2 of the learning outcomes that are stated. So we've got the 5 learning outcomes. Each course, course 1, approved course 2, approved course 3, 4, 5, and 6, has to meet 2 of the outcomes. Now then as we look at the array of courses, we notice something really important. All of the courses do indeed meet outcome number 1, explore global and cultural diversity. That's not a surprise. That may be the only one of those student learning outcomes that I actually understand what it means. Okay, so this is not a surprise, and we've got a fair number of courses who might meet number 2, but look at 4 and 5. Not a single course approved in Gen Ed selected either outcome 4 or outcome 5 as outcomes that course supports. So here's the problem now for assessment. At this point, we say we have 5 student learning outcomes in arts and humanities, but only 3 of them, okay, are supported by courses, and even outcome 3 is only passingly supported. Outcome 1 is the only probably legitimate outcome of these 5. And yet, if we're asked to assess all 5 of them, the data we're going to come up with is going to be really suspect as we get down this list, simply because there's no courses supporting the achievement of these 2 outcomes. So my guess is, okay, that a lot of schools that have multiple outcomes in each category, where schools are choosing which outcomes they support, have a number of outcomes on the books that aren't really student learning outcomes, only by virtue of the fact that no course actually supports them. We need to remember that different degree programs have different gen ed requirements. This is really important, especially if you're a school that offers multiple levels of degrees. So for instance, a gen ed curriculum in an AA or an AS or a BA or a BS degree generally is 60 credits, like 40 credits of gen ed and 20 credits of electives, but 40 or 45 credits of gen ed. Contrast this with an AAS degree that has maybe 15 credits of gen ed. The implications of the differences in that size of gen ed programs can't be ignored when you're assessing the program. Here's what it winds up looking like. So in terms of gen ed, you've got outcomes in writing, speech, math, natural science, social science, arts and humanities, critical thinking, and information literacy. In a 15 credit gen ed program, those credits are distributed in such a way that speech is not one of the outcomes, arts and humanities is not one, nor is critical thinking. Okay, this is a qualitatively different program than programs that have 30 credits of gen ed or 45 credits of gen ed. So when we're looking to assess students in gen ed, we have to be very cognizant of the fact that different degree programs have different gen ed expectations. We can illustrate this pretty carefully by just looking here. For a 15 credit and AAS degree, 15 credits, they've got 1 writing course as opposed to 2 writing courses. We would expect advanced development if students had to take 2 courses instead of 1. In speech, okay, AAS students, or the 15 credit students, have no speech at all. Okay, the other degrees take 1 course. In math, it's 1 course versus 2 courses. Same thing in natural science. Social science, a big gap, and the rest are the same. So we've got to think about that when we're assessing, especially if we're trying to create large sample sizes of students. We can't do that, or we have to be able to analyze the data, breaking down and holding for the fact that students had different gen ed experiences. So their outcomes are likely going to be different as well. You may need to work with some of your outcomes to make them meaningful and measurable. What we know, okay, that getting a gen ed program in place is really hard. It can take schools years to rewrite general education outcomes. We're not asking you to rewrite those outcomes. We know that sometimes the state gives you the gen ed outcomes and you've got to work with those. You don't have an opportunity to rewrite those. What you can do is rethink them and modify them. So even though we've got this official language on the board, we can figure out a way to make those outcomes accessible. Here's a first one. If the outcome is students will be able to gather factual information and apply it to a given problem in a manner that is relevant, clear, comprehensive, and conscious of possible bias in the information selected. This is a problematic outcome because it's got so much going on there, not to mention the fact that it's off-putting to start with. You show faculty this outcome, their eyes are going to roll. It's like, what do you do with this thing? Instead, if we reconstruct it with the same intent that students will be able to apply factual information to a problem, okay, we can sort of see our way out of that one in terms of assessing it. But what you'll notice here in this particular outcome, that they've included the performance indicators, relevant, clear, comprehensive, and conscious of possible bias, in the actual definition of the outcome. So basically, we're taking out the performance indicators, okay, and just focusing on this. We're not changing the language of the state requirement, if that's indeed what this is, but we're looking at it in a way that makes sense that we can assess. Here's another one. Students will be able to imagine and seek out a variety of possible goals, assumptions, interpretations, or perspectives, which can give alternative meanings or solutions to different situations or problems. Again, a whole lot of stuff going on here. Perhaps we can break it down to something that says students will be able to provide alternative solutions to a problem or a situation. In this case, they did not include the performance indicators in the outcome. So we would have to develop performance indicators, and some possibilities might be, are they able to identify alternative assumptions or perspectives? Are they able to analyze the advantages of those potential solutions? Finally, one more. Students will be able to formulate and test hypotheses by performing laboratory simulation or field experiments in at least 2 of the natural science disciplines. One of these should develop in greater depth students' laboratory experience in the collection of data, statistical, graphical analysis, appreciation of sources of error and uncertainty. Okay, you don't even really have to read beyond the first line to see what we're really looking at is students will be able to test hypotheses, or students will be able to formulate hypotheses, formulate and test hypotheses. Like the first example I showed you, the performance indicators are built into the outcome, and that's what makes this outcome needlessly complex. So again, I'm not asking you to rewrite your outcomes, especially if you just went through a battle to get them written in the first place, or they come from the state. But what you may want to do is rethink the outcomes to make them more approachable and more accessible and more meaningful. Once you know what your program outcomes are, the next step is to figure out how are we going to know if those outcomes are being achieved, and this is the assessment methods. If we think about this in terms of we could have outcomes for writing or interpersonally relating or speaking or listening and participating, and we'll just use speaking as an example, like we did in the open session yesterday. We know the performance indicators that we agree on are delivery, content, and organization. Okay, the assessment method is what the students are going to do to be able to demonstrate that they've achieved that student learning outcome. The assessment methods can be indirect, like surveys and questionnaires and interviews or focus groups, especially in co-curricular. Indirect outcome or indirect methods are very, very common. Less so in Gen Ed, but not impossible in terms of Gen Ed. You probably want, if you're using indirect methods, to use a mix of direct and indirect methods. Direct methods are where the students actually demonstrate their learning, like a standardized exam or a local exam, an essay or a report. They write some kind of a document or a performance or a recital, a clinical practicum, presentation, portfolio, a simulation. Again, we're actually seeing students applying the knowledge, students doing it in action. Now, your assessment methods are important because you have to make sure you think ahead to the next step. And the next steps in the assessment process are going to be actually collecting the data, interpreting the data, and using the data. So there's some very important things to consider here. For instance, the cost, how much time it's going to take, how hard it's going to be to do, and how credible the results are going to be. These are really important considerations. It's possible to design a really elegant assessment methodology that's totally impractical and unaffordable. So let's look at it this way: cost, time, complexity, and credibility. if students are going to take a standardized exam, let's say one of your outcomes is critical thinking, and you decide you're going to use an academic proficiency test related to critical thinking. There's a bunch of them out there. So if you choose to use a standardized exam, the cost may be between $10 and $20 for each student. So it's pricey. How much time is it going to take? Some of them are 40 minutes. Some of them are 90 minutes. But you think about it, it's not going to take faculty time because they can do it outside of class. Complexity, once you get the hang of administrating a large scale standardized exam, it's really not all that complex. And the credibility, you've got national norms. So there's a lot of credibility with some of those exams as long as their definition of, in this case, critical thinking is the same as your definition of critical thinking. But look at it this way, if you're going to try to do a gen ed portfolio, as a lot of schools decided they were going to do back in 2000, 2001, up until 2005, everyone thought portfolios was the answer to their assessment question. The problem is that having students collect all of their learning in terms of gen ed is a great idea until they all show up with their milk crates full of stuff or their discs. Or their PowerPoint slides or with their evidence of learning, and somebody's got to go through all of that to be able to assess it, which usually means bringing faculty in, often over the summer, often for additional contract time. So there's a huge cost. It takes a lot of time to go through. It's very complex because now we have to have rubrics for each of those different gen ed outcomes, and we have to train faculty to identify, okay, those the different performance characteristics in each one of those. And the credibility is going to be suspect based on the integrated reliability or what steps you have taken to make sure that you're accurately reviewing the artifact presented. It's not just assessment methods you need to consider, but also your assessment measures. Remember, it goes like this. First, you got your outcomes, then your performance indicators, then your assessment method, what the students are going to do, then your measure. I think a lot of times schools will jump to the measure without thinking back to everything else. I think we saw some of this back maybe 5 years ago when the value rubrics first came out. There's probably more like 7 or 8 years ago now, when the value rubrics first came out and people saw the measure, the rubric, and said, wow, this is great. We'll use these rubrics, even though they may not have been a good fit for our measures or our performance indicators. So if we've got a learning outcome and we've got performance indicators, different assessment measures might be, okay, using a self-assessment survey, at which point the measure is the percentage of students, okay, arrayed across the different categories, okay, frequency distribution essentially. For a quiz or exam, again, the questions on the quiz or the exam are loaded on the performance indicators, and the method, the assessment measure, is the number or percentage of questions the students answered correctly on each one of the performance indicators. For a checklist, again, another assessment measure, we've got the performance indicators, and we're looking at yes or no, were they able to do it or not. Now, this makes sense if you're looking at a process or a procedure or some kind of sequential ordering of something that a student needs to do. Did they do this? Did they do this? Did they do this? It does not tell us anything about the quality with which they achieved these things, just that they did indeed do this particular set of things. So a checklist is another assessment measure. We can refine the checklist perhaps a little bit and use more of a scale and anchor the scale in terms of did not do it or did it very well, and have gradations in there. Taking that scale sense a bit further, it's not just having numbers, but now we can actually create a rubric where we have descriptions of the quality, descriptions of the student work, the quality of the student work in each one of these squares. So let's talk more about rubrics, because rubrics is one of the most common assessment measures. Rubrics describe the level of performance, as I was just talking about, and this is the criteria against which learning is assessed, and the expected learning that we have for student performance. It provides guidance to students, and it's useful for multiple raters. So we can have, for instance, a student is doing, let's go back to the portfolio. You decide to do portfolio, multiple raters are using the same rubric to assess student learning. So we've got the performance indicators, we've got the performance descriptions. We also have performance anchors. So basically, these are headings for the different categories of performance that we'll talk about in a moment, but the performance anchors sort of give us direction for each one of these performance categories. So in a summative rubric, again, each performance indicator is assessed separately. It defines performance, it defines expected performance, and the benchmark is actually built into the rubric by virtue of it being a summative rubric. Because in these rubrics, you always seem to have a category that says meets expectations, meets standards, or proficient. And so this becomes our benchmark, our level of expectation for student performance. In a developmental rubric, on the other hand, this documents students' progress towards deeper learning or a maturation in their thinking. The benchmark then is relative to the degree program and the student's progression in the program. So we have the same kind of rubric with performance descriptions, and each level advances the cognitive level or the cognitive processes towards achieving the outcome, or achieving the performance indicators. So it might be that we anchor then the different levels of performance in terms of comprehend, apply, analyze, and adapt. One thing to consider here very strongly is that when we're talking about different degrees and different gen ed programs, for some students who are only taking one credit in, or one class in some of the gen ed categories, apply may be our goal category. For students who have 3 or 4 classes, or if it's an institution-wide outcome, where not only does gen ed support the institutional outcomes, but so do courses in the major, we may be looking at analyze and adapt as our target performance level. So it's not cut and dried like it is in this the summative rubric, where we have a proficient category where we're assuming all of our students will achieve this level of proficiency. There are a lot of decisions that need to be made when creating an implementation plan. So we've got who's going to collect the data, who will aggregate it, who will interpret it, who will report it, who's going to respond to the data, and you've got lots of choices of people that can be involved at the different levels. So you've got a lot of different decisions that you're going to need to make. And again, these are decisions that through the course of the academy, your mentor and your scholar will be there to help you evaluate the options and the choices that you have to make here. Essentially, you've got 4 questions that you're going to need to address in the course of implementing your gen ed assessment plan. The first one is, who are you going to assess? When are you going to assess them? Who's going to actually do the assessing? And then what happens? And I really caution you to think ahead to, and then what happens? Because if you stop with just, we're going to do this, and you don't think about what happens next, you may get yourself into an uncomfortable situation with a pile of data and no idea what you're going to do with it. So the factors to consider when developing your implementation plans are really straightforward. Student motivation. How motivated are students going to be to do their best work? If you're using an assignment that students are already doing to be graded in class, there's a much higher level of motivation than if you're pulling them out of class to have them sit and take a gen ed exam, a critical thinking exam that has no relevance to them at all. How much training is involved to collect reliable data? Do we need to train a whole set of faculty members to use a rubric reliably, or can one person do it? In terms of faculty engagement, we want faculty to be engaged in the process, and the more we remove assessment from the faculty, the less meaningful assessment becomes. So again, using the example of a standardized exam, it's possible faculty would have no involvement in the taking of a standardized exam. Students are called out of class, they do it at a testing center, the results come back from ACT or ETS or whomever, and faculty have no sense of what was on that exam or what it means, or if this data is even meaningful. Finally, the potential to impact learning. What is the potential to provide information that would help improve learning? We've got to ask ourselves, is the structure of our implementation, is that really giving us an insight into student learning, or are we creating something that's totally artificial that's going to be relatively meaningless? So let's go back to those questions. Who are we going to assess? We need to keep in mind the assessment question. To what degree have our students achieved our general education learning outcomes? And think about that. So if we've got, this is our question, sorry, if this is our question, who are we going to assess? Who would be the best students to answer this question? When are we going to assess student learning? Are we going to do it at specific credit thresholds, after 15 credits, after 45 credits, after 60 credits, before graduation, at a particular assessment event? We've got an annual assessment day, and that's where we're going to collect assessment data, or in specific courses. We're going to assess writing in the second required gen ed writing class or something like that. So we've got to be able to think about, when are we going to assess student learning? Who is going to do the assessing? Is it going to be students self-assessing? Will faculty be assessing, an administrator, a faculty committee, a departmental committee, the assessment committee? Will it be the department chair? Or will we have an employer do it, as in the case of an internship or practicum? So lots of different choices to think about. And finally, what happens after that? So who's going to see the data? In what format are they going to see the data? When are they going to see the data? And what are the expectations related to, and what will be done with the data? So let's go back to our example of a standardized exam. Students take the standardized exam, it goes back to ETS or ACT, they send back the report. Now what? Do faculty see it? Are we going to have a discussion about it? Is there going to be an obligation, if there's a problem, for faculty to figure out how they're going to address this situation in their classes? We have to understand how the cycle continues after we actually have data. We know that that data that we're going to get can be looked at in numerous ways. So going back to using a rubric, for instance, this is a writing rubric. Students will be able to convey information in a written format. We have performance indicators like supporting details, organizational pattern, language, rules of standard English, figures and charts. And we've got descriptions of exceed standards, meet standards, below standard, or progressing to standard. Okay, so we've got the rubric. One way to present it, okay, is an aggregate score for the rubric. The average score for across all the indicators and all students was 2.86. Okay, this is one of the problems if you're putting all the data into, for instance, a database. It's likely that it will reduce the data to a single number. The question becomes, does this help us answer our assessment question? To what degree can our students convey information in a written format? How does this help us understand student learning? 2.86 is not going to provide much information at all to us. It makes more sense if we were instead to take a look at the average performance score by the different indicators. So we see that students did best on language. They did pretty well in organization and conventions. They struggled a little bit with supporting details, and the lowest score was on incorporating figures and graphs. So that's another way to take a look at it, is by individual indicator. This provides us with more information. We can still look at it yet a different way related to the different indicators and ask ourselves, what percentage of students met the expectations, not just what the score was, but what percentage of students met the expectations. So in this case, we know that 87%, almost 90% of our students met our expectation relative to language, but yet only 62% met in terms of figures and graphs, and the rest were in between. So thinking about it in terms of, think about the story you want to tell about your data, because you can look at it different ways. Still, another way to look at it is to look at the average individual score across all performance students by the number, all performance indicators by the number of students. For instance, we had 3 students who scored at a 2.4 as an average score, 2.6. We had 4 students score there. So we can look at modes and means this way. Finally, you can take a look at the data by looking at the percentage of students who meet or exceeded standard on each indicator. So we know that 12% of the students met 2 indicators, 37% met expectations on 3 indicators, 25% apiece met expectations on 4 indicators, and 25%, 1 out of 4 students, met our expectations on all 5 indicators. Again, this tells a different assessment story. You can present it this way, but you get the idea that there's multiple ways to look at your data. And again, this is far ahead of where you are right now. But as you get to this point, these are the conversations you'll be having with your mentor and your scholar in terms of how to best present the data to tell your assessment story to help facilitate improvement and celebrate your achievement. The last thing I want to talk about is probably one of the more important issues, and that is you can't do this by yourself. As wonderful as I know your assessment team is going to be, your ASL Academy team is, you're going to need support from other parts of the campus. So how do we build engagement? The most important resource you have at your disposal if your project is going to undertake gen ed assessment learning is people. So you've got to be careful not to squander anybody's time. Okay, so you can't ask for people to do things that isn't going to be important or valuable or pre-tested to make sure that it makes sense. So be very, very careful of how you're using your colleagues' time. Think about who you need to engage and at what level you need their engagement and when do you need it. So we don't need everybody doing everything all the time. It's not, assessment is not, as I said in the meaningful assessment piece yesterday, assessment is not every single faculty assessing every single student on every single outcome in every single class, every single semester. Okay, that's going to generate far more data than you can ever manage reasonably. So we want to think about this and consider very carefully how we're going to use our colleagues' time. Remember that some faculty will be involved in assessment committee work, some will be involved in data collection, some will be involved in data analysis, some might even emerge as the champion for a particular student learning outcome in your general education program. All faculty, however, should be involved in affirming the performance indicators for the outcomes. All faculty should be involved in mapping the curriculum to the performance indicators. All faculty should be involved in reviewing the results at some level. So it can't just be that the report gets filed, it gets sent over to the 4B accreditation committee and no one else ever sees the data or has a conversation about what this means. Finally, all faculty have a role in implementing the recommendations, again, at some level. So let's say we do the assessment the first year, the second year in August at Faculty Development Days, we present the results, and then it's our obligation, it's the obligation of knowing, to present ideas in terms of how do we each own as faculty members, as staff members, as faculty and co-curricular, how do we all own our part of that outcome and dedicate ourselves to working with that outcome to continue to support it at its current level, if it's good, or how are we going to work to help students better achieve that particular student learning outcome. Your role in the process is really important. Think about it, and there'll be another breakout session on communicating. Please if you have a moment, please take a look at that breakout session too. You want to be careful not to apologize when asking your colleagues to do something for gen ed assessment. Okay, you have to assume that this is part of what everybody needs to do in order to do the best job for our students. I always find it's more helpful to talk about student learning than it is to talk about assessment. Faculty like talking about student learning. Assessment may make you not really extremely popular on your campus, but starting with talking about student learning in general education. Please do not make promises you can't keep, like this will not take any time, or you'll be able to do this in 15 minutes. Don't set it up that way. You probably want to avoid blaming HLC for the workload that has been created, because what happens is if you do it right, you create a culture where assessment of student learning becomes part of what you do. It's all about that creating a culture of learning that we talked about early on. Okay, if that's what we're really focused in on in terms of creating a culture of learning, it's not about HLC and accreditation cycles. It's about doing the right things for our students. Finally, please don't express any kinds of doubts about whether or not the process is valuable. Your job is to get your communication plan straight, get your stories straight, and present this in a positive light, and not like, oh my God, I'm on this academy project and we all have to do this. That's not going to help you get the job done. You want to expand your circle by involving different faculty at different points in time in different capacities, and make this work to create a culture of learning relative to general education assessment.